The public square looked nothing like it had before the war. Where children once played and vendors once sold fruit and ribbons, there were now fences, rope lines, and chalk markings showing where civilians were supposed to stand. It was late in World War II, during the years when towns no longer used their squares for celebration but for control, and soldiers shouted orders that bounced off stone buildings like echoes of rules rather than voices. The sky hung low and gray, and the cold air carried the smell of burned wood and diesel from the trucks that idled near the town hall. People kept their heads down as they waited in lines made not for shopping or festivals, but for questioning, curfew checks, and district clearances. A wooden board displayed new instructions about movement and silence, and the chalk beside it listed the time of evening inspections. No one argued with the chalk. Chalk did not blink or change tone. Chalk was final. Local militia moved through the lines, checking identity slips and ration cards, pushing some civilians to one line and some to another without much explanation. At the far edge of the square, near a statue now covered by tarps, two soldiers whispered about the next day's handover of authority to the British units that had arrived recently at the depot. The militia did not like the idea of losing power in the square, because power in wartime was rarely about paperwork alone. It was about who could tell others where to stand and how to keep their eyes lowered. Across the cobblestones, a group of British soldiers observed the scene while unloading crates and blankets near a field car. But they did not interfere yet. Their captain paced slowly, clipboard in hand, studying the town's layout as if planning a map rather than watching a crowd. The square was crowded but strangely quiet. People knew that sound traveled as easily as accusation. Rumors in wartime needed only two ingredients: someone to start them and someone to repeat them. Between the rope lines, a young woman tried to adjust her coat and balance a small bag of bread she had collected from a bakery window before the shutters closed. Her breath formed weak white clouds in the air as she stepped over puddles formed from melting snow. When she reached the square, militia pointed her to a holding area near the statue. She did not know whether this meant delay or punishment. Civilians nearby stepped aside to create space between themselves and the woman, not because she had done anything wrong, but because they did not know how to protect her if she had. The British captain continued his pacing, marking details on his clipboard. He noted the distance between the rope lines and the truck, the number of militia guarding the statue, and the direction of the civilians' eyes. He was trained to understand not only military maps but atmospheres, and this atmosphere contained a kind of fear that did not belong to roads or bridges, but to people. As he paused to study the town hall clock tower, a cold gust pushed across the square and rattled tin cups at a water station. The crowd shivered, as if reacting to one shared thought. Night was coming, and night never came alone during war. The square held its breath for a moment before the next order was shouted. It was a short order, sharp and final, and though not everyone understood the language, everyone understood the meaning. Civilians were expected to obey, to move, to kneel, to be silent when told. It was the kind of order that turned a square into a demonstration and a person into an example. That was when the British captain finally stopped pacing and faced the statue. His hand tightened around the clipboard, not in anger, but in recognition that something in the square had crossed a line. Earlier that afternoon, before the lines had fully formed, and before the militia raised their voices, the square functioned as a kind of meeting point for civilians trying to finish their errands before curfew. Shops had reduced hours, bakeries sold bread only through small windows, and families collected what they could before shutters closed and streets emptied. The woman at the center of the later commotion had been one of them. She walked through the cold with a small bag of bread tucked beneath her arm, crossing streets marked by sandbags and posted notices that warned civilians not to loiter. Her boots tapped against the stones in a steady rhythm as she made her way toward the square, where rumors said the militia handed out information about new evacuation lists and ration updates. People did not go to the square for conversation. They went for instruction. By the time she reached the square's entrance, several civilians had already been organized into two lines for questioning. A wooden table had been set up near the covered statue, and a kettle steamed behind it, so the militia could keep their hands warm while checking documents. The woman hesitated for a moment, unsure which line to join, and a man carrying a ration bag pointed to the left. She thanked him quietly and stepped into place, careful not to drop her bread or bump into the elderly woman in front of her. The militia asked short, fast questions: name, address, reason for movement, time of departure. Civilians answered in the same rhythm. Knowing long answers slowed the line and drew attention. The British had not yet moved into the square at this stage, so their trucks and field cars remained parked along a side street, while their captain examined a map against a wall. The town was scheduled to come under British oversight the next day, and handovers during war happened in strange ways, sometimes through signatures in a dusty room, sometimes through orders shouted in a public square. But until the handover was complete, the square still belonged to the militia, and the militia used it to show that control had not slipped from their fingers. The woman watched others ahead of her answer their questions and be waved through toward the rope line. Some were sent home early because they lacked the proper reason for being out. Others were told to wait for further instruction. When it was her turn, the militia asked about her bread and her route. She explained that the bakery had nearly sold out, and that she had waited longer than expected, which slowed her return. The militia listened with blank expressions that revealed nothing. They whispered among themselves, then told her to step aside and wait. No explanation, no reason, just wait. Civilians in wartime became familiar with that word. It could mean 5 minutes, 5 hours, or no return at all. She stepped where they pointed and clutched her bread bag tighter as the line continued without her. The square grew louder as more civilians entered from side streets, hoping to complete their questions before curfew. Snowflakes drifted across the stone walkway and landed on the tarps covering the statue, collecting in folds and corners. Through all of this, the woman remained near the holding point, uncertain whether she was being delayed or punished. She shifted her weight to keep her feet warm and watched the militia move quickly between tables, ropes, and civilians. On the far side of the square, the British captain took notes on his clipboard, tracing the movement of people and the patterns of control. His training had taught him to read not just terrain, but interactions, where power gathered, where fear collected, where rules were enforced or ignored. He looked up toward the covered statue just in time to see the militia gather around the woman, as if preparing to make a demonstration. He folded his map, tightened the strap of his coat, and began moving toward the square, unaware that within minutes he would step into the center of a confrontation that had not been planned, but had been waiting for someone to witness it. The militia did not need much to escalate, a simple delay into a public denial. All it took was one soldier saying she had ignored instructions and another repeating it as if it were confirmed fact. The woman tried to ask if she should join another line or wait to be called, but each time she opened her mouth, the militia waved her off as though her words occupied space better used by orders. Eventually, one of the soldiers told her to stop talking altogether. Civilians nearby lowered their eyes. Speaking for someone else without permission could invite attention, and attention in wartime was rarely a reward. The woman held her bread against her side and tried not to shiver as the cold pressed through her coat. People continued to pass through the square, answering questions and obeying instructions, while the woman remained separated from the group without clarity. After a few minutes, a small group of civilians began whispering among themselves. One asked the militia why the woman was being held aside, but the soldier only responded, "Failure to follow directions." When the civilian asked what direction she had failed to follow, no answer came. That was how many denials worked during the war. First the accusation, then silence, then instructions for spectators to keep moving. The militia resumed processing the next civilians, and the woman was no longer part of the line. She was part of the demonstration. The denial hardened when the militia changed their questioning pattern. They began asking civilians if they had seen the woman earlier, if she had come from another direction, if she had rushed into the square instead of approaching the line properly. Civilians gave confused answers. Some shrugged. Some shook their heads. Others looked away to avoid being involved. The woman tried to speak again, but the militia shut her down with a sharp gesture. "You will wait," one soldier snapped. The tone carried more authority than the words. Waiting was no longer a delay. It was an order. The woman swallowed and held still. Minutes passed, and the cold intensified. The woman shifted her feet to avoid numbness, and her bread bag slid slightly from her arm. A soldier scoffed and pointed. "If she had time to shop, she had time to check in properly," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. A few civilians nodded in agreement, simply because it was easier to nod than to argue. In wartime squares, the hardship often appeared as a test, and denial became a performance meant to remind the crowd who controlled the rules. On the opposite end of the square, the British captain observed the shift in atmosphere. When he had first arrived, the square was structured but quiet. Now it carried the tension of something moving from administrative to punitive. His clipboard lowered slightly as he studied the militia's stance and the civilians' expressions. He had seen similar patterns in other towns where control was maintained through humiliation rather than documentation. None of it was part of the agreement for handover schedules, and none of it aligned with Allied policy for civilian protection. Still, he did not intervene yet. Instead, he signaled to one of his soldiers to stay alert and continue to watch. But the refusal to let the woman rejoin the group extended into something more symbolic. Instead of being instructed to leave or to pay a fine, she was positioned as a lesson. The militia lined up several civilians across from her, as if comparing obedience with disobedience. The woman pressed her coat tighter around her ribs, her breath visible in the cold air, her eyes lowering not out of guilt, but survival. During wartime, public denial did not need to prove whether someone was wrong. It only needed the appearance that someone was being corrected. The woman stood alone in front of the crowd, waiting not for news or permission, but for whatever the militia intended to do with her next. Rumor in wartime moved faster than any official message, faster than printed notices, faster than the trucks that carried orders from one block to the next. All it needed was a spark, a whispered phrase, a raised eyebrow, a guess spoken with confidence. And suddenly, the square had a story to repeat. The spark appeared when one of the militia muttered that the woman had come from the South Street instead of the West Gate, and another suggested that the South Street was used by runners who carried messages for the resistance. None of it was confirmed, none of it was proven, and none of it required evidence. Civilians nearby leaned closer to each other and began stitching rumors together as if mending torn cloth. "Maybe she warned someone," one said. "Maybe she was carrying something," another added. The woman stood silently, unable to correct any of it without drawing more attention or punishment. The bread bag under her arm became a prop in the rumor. A teenager whispered that she might be using the bread to signal someone. A man shook his head and said bread could hide papers. Someone else claimed they saw her talking to strangers earlier, though no such encounter had happened. With each guess, the rumor grew heavier and more convincing to those who preferred quick explanations over complicated truths. Civilians in the rope line shuffled further away from her, forming a space as if rumor could jump between bodies like illness. The woman felt the cold more sharply now, not because of the weather alone, but because exclusion had its own temperature. The militia did nothing to correct the rumors. In fact, then their silence served as permission for the stories to expand. When the militia withheld clarity, the crowd supplied its own. The British captain, stationed near the field car, recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen it in other towns, rumor filling the gaps where authority refused to speak. If someone was accused of being a runner or a collaborator, even without proof, the accusation became equal to evidence in the minds of civilians who wanted safety above accuracy. A woman in a heavy coat whispered to her friend that they only make examples out of important cases, implying the kneeling woman must have done something significant. Another civilian insisted the militia would not waste time humiliating someone unless there was a reason. Logic, during wartime, bent easily in favor of power. If the militia did it, many assumed there must be justification somewhere, even if no one could identify it. The woman being accused did not speak up because there was no path for speech. The square did not contain microphones or defense benches. It contained orders, rope lines, and silence. The exclusion became physical when the militia ordered the crowd to pull back several steps. Civilians obeyed quickly, widening the gap around the woman. She now stood at the center of a circle of cold, a circle created not by chalk lines or fences, but by rumor. The militia paced around her, not striking her or touching her, but using her presence to reinforce their authority. Even without violence, humiliation achieved its purpose. It reminded civilians that anyone could be pulled from the line without explanation. Across the square, two British soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. They had been told to observe until handover was finalized, but nothing in the handover instructions had mentioned public punishment or rumor-based accusations. One soldier asked the captain quietly, "Is this part of their rules?" The captain did not answer immediately. Instead, he stared in the direction of the woman, noting how the bread bag had now become a symbol, how the silence of the militia amplified guilt more than any shouted accusation, and how the square had accepted the exclusion as a kind of spectacle. The woman did not shake, cry, or plead. She simply remained upright, her bread pressed against her coat, her eyes fixed on the cobblestones. The moment the militia shifted from rumor to punishment was quiet, almost casual, the way some decisions in war slipped into place without ceremony. One soldier stepped behind the woman and tapped the stone with the toe of his boot, as if marking the spot. Another pointed at the ground and gave a short command for her to kneel. The command was not shouted. It did not need to be. In that square, volume was not the source of power. Control was. The woman hesitated, not out of defiance, but because kneeling meant surrendering balance, warmth, and dignity all at once. Before she could form a question, the militia repeated the order more sharply, and the small crowd understood what would happen if she delayed again. She lowered herself slowly, placing her bread bag on the ground beside her to avoid crushing it. Her knees pressed into the cold stone, and the snow melted beneath her skirt, chilling her through the cloth. The square reacted the way squares often did during public humiliation, with silence in some areas and whispers in others. A few civilians turned their faces away so they would not have to witness what they could not prevent. Others leaned forward to see better, as though curiosity could substitute for courage. A man at the edge of the rope line muttered that, "This is why people must follow directions," as if scolding her would protect him from being next. A woman covering a child's eyes pulled him closer and whispered that they could not speak up. Not today. Not before the change in command. In wartime, punishment sometimes targeted a single person, but taught a lesson to hundreds. The militia did not strike the woman. They did not bind her hands, and did not give any speech about guilt. The humiliation worked without those additions. The simple act of kneeling in public, in the square where she once bought ribbons and fruit before the war, was enough to turn her into a symbol of failure. Snowflakes collected on her shoulders and hair, turning her into something between a civilian and a statue. The bread sat untouched beside her, its white packaging slowly soaking through as moisture leaked into the paper. A few civilians assumed the militia would escalate further, perhaps force her to confess or name someone. But the militia did not need confessions. They needed submission, and kneeling provided that image. The British captain had moved closer by then, clipboard tucked under his arm, boots crunching through slush. He watched as the militia circled the kneeling woman without touching her, turning their authority into spectacle. The captain's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. He knew the difference between lawful control and public humiliation. This scene fell into the second category. One of the British soldiers whispered, "Are we to let this happen?" The captain did not answer yet. He scanned the militia for signs of formal authorization, armbands, paperwork, stamped orders, but saw none. Authority in the square was built from tone, posture, and rumor, not from documents. The woman's breathing grew shallow as cold worked through her clothes. Her knees throbbed and her fingers ached from trying to keep her balance. Still, she did not plead. Pleading implied negotiation, and negotiation implied responsibility. Most civilians who had lived through several winters of occupation learned not to supply words when silence could shorten the ordeal. She stared at the cobblestones and counted her breaths, waiting for either release or further humiliation. For the militia, time itself became part of the punishment. Each minute she remained kneeling increased the meaning of the act for the crowd. Had they forced her down for just a moment and let her stand again, the lesson might have felt weak. But kneeling through snow, humiliation, and rumor created a stronger impression, and impressions mattered when power was uncertain. The British handover, scheduled for the next day, made the militia nervous. Punishing someone in the square was a way of insisting they still held authority. The British captain finally drew a slow breath and stepped forward. In the moment his boots crossed the invisible line between spectator and participant, several militia straightened their posture and adjusted their coats. They recognized that authority had arrived, not the kind built from rumor, but the kind built from rank and agreements. The captain fixed his eyes on the kneeling woman first, then on the soldiers circling her, and the square paused as if waiting for a new set of rules to enter. When the British captain reached the center of the square, the atmosphere shifted in a way civilians could feel, even without understanding military ranks. His uniform was clean, but not decorative, his boots heavy enough to be heard on the cobblestone, and his clipboard carried more weight than some rifles because it represented responsibility and agreement, not intimidation. Two British soldiers followed at a short distance, maintaining a respectful gap so the captain would not appear as if he were storming the scene. The militia stiffened at his approach, not because they feared violence, but because they feared questions. Questions introduced accountability, and accountability required justification, which the militia did not have prepared. The captain stopped in front of the kneeling woman, his shadow falling across the stones. He assessed her quietly first, noting the bread bag on the ground, the wet patch forming beneath her knees, and the way she kept her eyes down, not from guilt, but from cold and caution. Civilians did not kneel voluntarily in public squares. Kneeling was a statement forced upon them. He looked up at the militia and asked a simple question. "What is the charge?" The militia exchanged quick glances. The soldier closest to the captain cleared his throat and muttered, "Failure to follow directions." The captain lifted an eyebrow slightly. "Which directions?" The militia offered no detail. The civilians, watching from the rope line, held their breath, as if the question itself were a form of resistance. A second militia member tried to frame the accusation differently. "Suspected courier," he said, as if placing the word "suspected" in front of something gave it authority. The captain paused his clipboard against his arm and asked, "Evidence." The militia again had only silence. Rumor did not produce evidence. It produced stories that only the frightened could accept as truth. The captain turned his head slightly toward the British soldiers behind him, and one of them stepped forward to make a note on his own small pad. The militia did not miss the gesture. Notes meant reports, and reports could lead to consequences after the handover. The captain then asked a different kind of question. Under what regulation is kneeling authorized? The militia froze. There was no such regulation. Humiliation had been improvised as a tool, not legislated as a rule. A few civilians exchanged looks, recognizing that someone was finally saying aloud what no one else dared to question. The captain did not raise his voice or threaten. He spoke slowly, as if giving the militia time to realize they had placed themselves in a position with no sturdy foundation. One militia member attempted to salvage authority by saying the woman was interfering with procedure, but the captain only repeated, "Procedure does not include public punishment." The woman on the ground lifted her head slightly, not enough to meet anyone's eyes, but enough to hear more clearly. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air, and she waited without speaking. The captain moved his gaze toward the rope lines, where civilians stood in a tight cluster. Their faces showed quiet approval, relief, and also fear. Approval because someone with rank had joined the situation. Relief because the humiliation might end, and fear because the militia could still resist. The captain recognized that dynamic immediately. Public squares were stages during war, and whatever happened in them wrote the rules civilians remembered. The captain finally shifted his stance and addressed the militia with finality rather than inquiry. This district transfers at dawn. Public discipline of civilians ends now. It was not a suggestion. It was notification. The militia had spent months exercising control in that square, and now control was sliding from their hands like chalk washed away by rain. The captain tapped his clipboard once and took a slow breath that signaled the next step had already been decided. The woman remained kneeling, unsure whether she was allowed to rise, waiting for permission that had not yet been spoken. The captain stepped closer to the kneeling woman and lowered his clipboard to his side, removing the last barrier between command and the person suffering under it. He did not touch her or offer his hand, because in wartime gestures had meaning, and helping someone stand before releasing them could imply guilt or dependence. Instead, he addressed the militia directly and clearly. "Stand her up." His tone was firm, but not loud, the tone of someone who did not require volume to achieve compliance. For a moment, no one moved. The militia looked at each other as though hoping another would take responsibility for either obeying or resisting. The captain waited only a second before shifting to a stronger form of intervention. "If you refuse," he said, "I will consider this an obstruction of transfer protocol and act accordingly." Transfer protocol was not a threat in the violent sense. It was far heavier. It meant paperwork, reports, discipline, and an audit after handover. The kind of consequences militia feared more than any raised rifle. With that, one of the militia reluctantly stepped forward and told the woman to stand. She pushed herself up slowly, her knees stiff from the cold, holding onto the bread bag for balance. Once upright, she kept her eyes down until the captain said, "Look at me." His voice carried none of the cruelty the militia had used. It simply established that she was no longer the object of humiliation, but a participant in a legal exchange. She lifted her gaze. Her face was pale from cold and tension, and snowflakes clung to her hair. The captain studied her briefly, not for guilt, but for clarity. "Name?" he asked. She gave her name softly, and he nodded once. "Reason for being in the square?" "Bread," she answered. She held up the bag. A simple truth, spoken plainly, with no dramatic story and no political undertone. The captain turned back to the militia. "And this is the courier you've detained?" His tone made the accusation sound absurd, and a ripple of discomfort passed through the soldiers. The militia attempted to defend their actions. One muttered that she approached from the wrong street, as though street origin could define loyalty. Another insisted that she did not follow instructions. The captain asked again, Which instructions, written or spoken? The militia had no answer. Only civilians with protective privilege could ask such questions without punishment. Civilians watched with wide eyes because they recognized what was happening. Rumor was collapsing under inquiry. For months, rumor had been enough to condemn, relocate, restrict, or shame without evidence. Now, rumor was being weighed against a clipboard and procedure, and rumor was losing. The captain then spoke the words that changed the woman's category entirely. She is under British protection. The phrase was simple, but in wartime it carried enormous legal weight. Under British protection meant she could not be punished, moved, questioned, or humiliated by the militia without risking diplomatic consequences. The captain gestured to his sergeant. "Escort her." The sergeant stepped forward and motioned for the woman to follow him toward the British sector of the square, away from the rope lines and the humiliation stage. At that moment, the crowd experienced a shift that was almost physical. Civilians leaned forward slightly, breathing easier now that the narrative had changed. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. Wartime dignity did not arrive in celebration but in silence, in restored posture, in being allowed to walk upright rather than kneel on stone. The militia stepped back, some out of reluctance, some out of resignation, and some out of recognition that their authority had evaporated without a struggle. And the woman, still unsure whether she should walk quickly or slowly, simply followed the sergeant with her bread pressed against her chest. The sergeant led the woman toward the British side of the square, with steady, measured steps designed not to draw spectacle. He did not place a hand on her arm or shoulder, because guidance without contact allowed her to walk as a civilian, not as a suspect. The rope line opened for them without resistance, and civilians watched as the category change occurred in real time. A woman under humiliation became a woman under escort, and escort meant protection. When they reached the crates near the field car, the sergeant motioned for her to sit on a small wooden bench that had been placed there for map reading earlier in the afternoon. The woman lowered herself onto it carefully, still holding her bread, as though it were proof of her original purpose. A British private approached with a wool blanket and offered it without ceremony. She accepted it and wrapped it around her knees, the fabric absorbing the cold that lingered in her bones from kneeling on stone. Across the square, the British captain remained with the militia to finalize the transition. He opened his clipboard and read from a page outlining the temporary civilian guidelines scheduled to take effect at dawn. "Public discipline of civilians is suspended," he stated, tapping the paper for emphasis. "Any suspected resistance collaboration falls under intelligence review, not militia display." The militia shifted uncomfortably. They had relied on displays to compensate for weak administrative power. Without public humiliation, their authority reduced to paperwork they did not possess. A few attempted to argue that the woman had disobeyed an order, but the captain cut through the claim with a single question. Did she endanger civilians? The militia had no such evidence. The captain checked another line on his sheet and continued. Civilian movement within the square remains permitted under curfew exceptions for food procurement and family needs. Food procurement. Bread. Her original task had been within regulation all along. Rumor, having enjoyed a long moment in the center of the square, collapsed without defenders. Civilians exchanged looks that contained relief and embarrassment in equal measure. Relief that the punishment ended. Embarrassment that none of them had questioned it. The militia no longer commanded attention. They simply existed in the space, awkwardly out of authority but not yet dismissed. The captain closed his clipboard. "Your oversight of the square ends at dawn. Until then, no civilian kneels. No civilian is punished publicly." He did not threaten consequences because none were required. The power had already shifted. When the captain finally walked toward the British sector, the group of civilians parted to allow him through. He reached the bench where the woman sat and observed her for a moment. Her breath had steadied. Her color had begun to return. The blanket warmed her knees, and the bread remained intact beneath the paper wrapping. "Stand," the captain said, but his tone was administrative rather than commanding. The woman rose slowly, holding the bread in one hand. The captain nodded once to her, then to the sergeant. The nod was the closest wartime language came to apology or recognition without violating the rules of formality. The captain turned to address the civilians at the rope line. "She is released," he announced, as if formalizing a decision already lived. Release mattered in wartime, not because it freed someone from chains, but because it restored them to the group. The civilians reacted not with cheers or clapping, but with soft exhalations and small adjustments of shoulders, the way people expressed relief when nobody was taken away for reasons they did not understand. The woman looked briefly toward the spot where she had knelt, then toward the bench where she now stood. The distance between those 2 points measured more than a few meters. It measured humiliation, rumor, intervention, and dignity restored. She pulled the blanket tighter and waited for the captain to finish speaking with his sergeant about the next phase of the handover. The captain dismissed the militia with the final notes of the handover brief, and the civilians slowly resumed their original tasks, collecting parcels, checking curfew times, and deciding which streets remained safest after dusk. The woman stayed near the British personnel for several minutes, not because she was required to, but because leaving too quickly could invite another challenge from someone seeking authority in the last hours before the transition. The sergeant seemed to understand that instinct and walked a short perimeter between her and the rope line, not aggressively, not demonstratively, simply enough to mark that the matter was closed. After a brief exchange of quiet instructions between the captain and a British corporal, the sergeant returned to the woman and said in plain terms, "You may go." She nodded once and stood, adjusting the wool blanket across her shoulders so that it would not fall as she walked. The path out of the square was not long, but it felt different now that her movement was voluntary. Civilians passing by did not stare. They gave small, respectful space, as though acknowledging that she had gone through something they understood without needing to describe. No one apologized for watching earlier, and no one asked questions about guilt or innocence. Wartime rarely offered apologies or explanations. It offered survival, and survival came in plain shapes. Near the fountain, an elderly woman tucked her grandson behind her skirt and gave the bread a discreet glance, as if checking that it had not been stolen or ruined. The woman with the blanket continued walking without slowing, not out of pride, but out of practicality. Curfew approached, and squared windows began to darken under blackout shutters. She paused at the far edge of the square, where the street narrowed. From that vantage point, she could see both the spot where she had knelt and the bench where she had sat after the intervention. Snow had patted the stones again, erasing the imprint of her knees as though the humiliation had never taken place. But memory did not erase as easily. The militia no longer stood in formation. They had dispersed into smaller clusters, unsure how to behave when their authority ended before the war did. The British soldiers continued marking crates and checking manifests, preparing for the coming handover. Somewhere in the square, a child laughed briefly, the sound cutting through the cold air like a reminder that life persisted despite conflict. The woman finally resumed her walk toward her building 2 streets away. The sergeant did not follow her, but he stepped out of the British sector just far enough to see her reach the eastern archway. He did not call out to her or offer advice. His job had never been to escort her home, only to ensure she left as a civilian rather than a warning. When she passed beneath the arch, he turned back to his duties without ceremony. The square was still cold, still tense, still governed by curfews and shortages. But one scene of humiliation had been stopped, and in wartime, that counted as a victory of a different kind. In her building, neighbors did not rush to meet her. They opened doors a few centimeters, enough to confirm she had returned, and then closed them again. She climbed the narrow staircase and entered her room, now placing the bread on the table and peeling back the wet outer paper so it could dry. She removed the blanket and folded it carefully, aware that wool was never wasted, not in winter, not in war. She rested her hands on the edge of the table and exhaled slowly, letting the heat from the stove seep into her fingers. The war had not ended. Soldiers still patrolled. Food was still rationed. Rumor still traveled faster than facts. But she had walked home, and she had walked home upright. Outside, the square's voices softened under curfew. The humiliation she endured would not become a legend or a broadcast. It would become one of many quiet stories of war, the kind civilians remembered during peace, long after battles were listed in books. And the British handover would continue at dawn, with paperwork, not spectacle, guiding the change. The war continued elsewhere, but she no longer carried the posture of someone forced to kneel.